Bonjour and welcome to the Red Lake Nation College Gikendaasowin Podcast. Join us each week for discussions on topics including culture and language, career exploration, RLNC student spotlights, student projects, and other RLNC services. This week we have part one of interview with RLNC instructor and academic advisor Carla Norris Rainbird, conducted with William May on July 7, 2019, about his experiences growing up as a fisherman in Red Lake. Red Lake Nation College would like to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for their generous support in the creation of these podcasts. Miigwech!
I was born and raised in the Red Lake community, and I was born in the hospital up at they call it we referred to it as the agency right here in Red Lake back in the day when I was born there. And I lived here in Red Lake all of my life. I did make a few trips to go stay in Minneapolis, and I did go to college at UMD in Duluth, and them are basically the only times I really ever left the res. Plus, I went to a boarding school in South Dakota in Flandre Indian School, and I was there from grade 9 all the way till end of the 11th grade. So I was there quite a while, and I enjoyed it there. Made a lot of friends from all over the country. However, that's a whole nother chapter of my life here that I lived here being in Red Lake. But I guess you wanted to kind of talk about growing up on the lake, being involved in the lake and activities that surround our great Red Lakes. And I guess I can start out by I did start already by saying I was born and raised here in Red Lake because that's all part of my story going into being involved with my family and relatives here with the commercial fishing that the Red Lake people took over, and 100 years ago when they took over the fishing industry in Red Lake, because from what I understand, our people back then, in 100 years ago, where they noticed that they were commercial fishing our lake in front of us, and I believe we may have been helping them, but to a minimal extent, very little. We were from the history that I've studied and looked at about commercial fishing, I believe we were helping them a little, but it was non-members and non-native people that were doing a majority of the commercial fishing, the harvesting of the fishing on our lake. And the history that I read in the conversations that we've had as to how that came about is that they started fishing, commercial fishing. They started taking the fish out of our lake, all species, back in the early 1900s, and it was used because there was a meat shortage in the world. It had to be World War I, because there was a world war going on at the time, and they needed food. So there was, from what I've read and what other people have we sat and discussed, is that there was a meat shortage during the war effort, so they had to come and start taking the state of Minnesota started commercial fishing our lakes, and they would and they're the ones that introduced commercial fishing onto our lakes, and we in the Red Lake band members indigenous people here were watching and seeing what was going on. And I can imagine, I suppose they gave them jobs, to help them out and with the commercial fishing effort and I guess back then there was a group of adult males, that seen what was going on, and I can imagine that they probably thought, well, hey, this is our lake, and they're taking all our fish and they're shipping it out, and it belongs to us. So eventually, what happened was the group of men formed an organization called a co-op, and they got bylaws, and they set up a system where they took over the commercial fishing industry from the non-native, non-band members, and started a commercial fishing industry here for the Red Lake people. There's a whole nother story to how that came about. Also, that's another story that kind of like how we came about of taking that back from the state of Minnesota. Mm-hmm. There was even a fish broker down in Winona, Minnesota, that took the state to court back in the early part of the century because he felt that the state should not be in the fishing industry, and he took them to court, and he beat him. So he got his way. That fish broker, he wanted to buy fish up here, and everybody knows what a fish broker is. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of some history as to how our people, the Red Lake Band members, there's more to it than that. I'm just kind of touching on some of it, and there's more to it than that. How that came about, how our people came to utilize gill nets here on our lake. That's there's a long story to that also, but that's where it all started. Mm-hmm. I remember my dad talking about my grandfather, who was born in 1888, so I can imagine in 1908 he was probably 20 years old. My great-grandfather, who I am named after, his name was Niigaaniigwan, and that's my name they gave me. That's how I ended up with that name. But he was born in 1888, and I remember my dad talking about fishing, commercial fishing, with his grandfather, who was Niigaaniigwan May, the one that was born in 1888. And so I can imagine, the things that he told me about how he went about, and how the commercial fishing started out way back then. They used to have wooden boats. There was boat builders around here back in that time. Right on the reservation, there was men here that that built boats, the big flat bottom fishing boats. They were probably a good 18 feet long, and they were really, really heavy, and they had flat bottoms. They looked pretty cool, though. I remember seeing those pulled up on the shore, the shoreline, around the lake. I would see them, and I remember being out on the lake in those type of boats back in the day. And there was men around here that learned that craft of building those type of boats, because they not only used to build those type of boats. I remember seeing them building a boat one time in a yard in a home, and that boat was it was set up kind of like on a rack, and they had it all measured out. They had saws and hammers and nails, and they were building those type of boats, and what became of that also is our guys, they switched from the birch bark canoes. They start building flat bottom ricing canoes also, ricing boats. They call them rice boats. I remember them building those way back in the 60s. Or I can remember it. I might remember all the way from back all the way to the late 50s. I remember them building those type of boats. But those are the type of boats that I remember the commercial fishermen, utilizing here in Red Lake, all the way around the lake. I seen pictures of, you can see the pictures, some of them, you might see those in Charles Brill, the guy that came up here and did all the pictures. He took hundreds and hundreds of pictures here all over Red Lake, Little Rock, Red Beef, Ponima. He took hundreds of pictures, and those pictures are all here in the archives. If anybody would ever like to see those, they're there. I know they have the book called Indian and Free, with a lot of his pictures in there, but there's hundreds more that people here in Red Lake have never seen that are in the archives right there. So they're available to look at if anybody who wants to look at those pictures. I might want to look at them myself. I did look at some of them, but not. There's so many you can't go through them in one day. But getting back to the commercial fishing, and back in they utilized my dad would tell me about my grandfather. He said they didn't use outboard motors. They didn't have outboard motors. There was a spot on the back of that boat that they would construct and make it so that they could add a outboard motor on the back of those wooden boats. But I remember my dad telling me one time my great-grandfather, for some reason, he preferred to use oars to oar out in the lake, to drop his nets, oar back in, then he'd oar out in the morning to go lift his nets. And I remember my dad telling me that my great-grandfather was he kind of made a statement one time. He said, well, I don't like using them outboard motors. They stir up the fish, they scare the fish away. That was kind of their reasoning back then as to why they really didn't like using outboard motors, and they just used oars. And everybody had their own, they call it their fishing grounds. Most families had their own when they first started out commercial fishing. I can't really go back to, how our people harvested fish back prior to commercial fishing, but I do see stories of where they would make their own gill nets, and I believe they probably were maybe 10, 20 feet long, maybe not even that, because they didn't have access to these big factory-made 300-foot gill nets that exist, today. Back then, I suppose they would have to make their own. I don't remember any of that, back, the gill nets that were made back then, and the type of fish traps that were utilized back then. I don't really remember any of that, but I remember they would use a minimal amount of gill nets. The gill net was 300 foot long by 6 feet wide, and they were 2.5 inch mesh stretch, they call that, and those are utilized to catch a lot. Then there was also another type of net called a whitefish net. I remember there was two types. Like they called one pike nets and they called one whitefish nets. There was the whitefish net was a bigger mesh that was utilized to catch bigger fish, or the whitefish in the fall time. But I remember my dad would tell me things that his grandpa talked about, and they all had their own fishing territory. They had their own landings. They would create their landings where they would come in every day, and they would build net racks on the shoreline, up on the shore on the high ground. They would put what they call a net rack. It was just 4 poles into the ground, and then 4 poles kind of nailed up high, and one person stood on one side and another person stood on another side. After they picked the fish out of the net, they would put it. It would be in a little pile, and they would carry it and set it down right below the 2 poles that were sticking out. And one person on one floater side, one person on the sinker side, because the sinkers would go on the bottom, or they would go on one side and the floaters on one side. Then they would just hang the net, the 300 foot. They would hang it up, kind of spread it out to dry. They'd kind of spread it out to dry. Getting back to the nets, there was sinkers on one side. There was a little thing made of lead. Then there was floats on one side, and that used to be made of wood back in the day. A little wooden floater about big as that cup, about that long, and that round. And that when they dropped the nets, the sinker would go to the bottom, but the float would stay on top, so that net would be standing up in the water. It would be like standing on end. And that's how the fish would swim into that. And that's how they would catch the fish. I just want to explain that a little bit about the net. And they would build, like I said, they would build the racks on the shoreline. For all their nets, they would hang up after the family would always be there in the morning. They would go. The men would go out and lift the nets, and they would bring them in, and they would usually go have a little bite to eat, but then they would announce that that the nets were down, they were in, and then the family would just kind of converge on them, and they would all work together. Mother and dad, grandparents, uncles, children would be playing around. If they're old enough, they would just let the children play. The children would play along the shoreline, play around in the woods and do things around her. And if they're old enough, they would hang nets. That's what we call hanging up the nets on a rack. Is hanging nets. That's what we call that. And that was usually the children. If they were old enough, they would do things like that. While the adults picked all the fish, picked the nets picked the fish out of the nets. They're the ones that would do that. And all the family, sometimes they would build a fire. They would build a fire on a shoreline on a little. They always had like a little firewood there, and they would also build a fire, to keep the mosquitoes away. And sometimes they would have a pot of coffee going on there, and everybody would then the family would just be there working and picking the nets and visiting and talking and sharing jokes and stories and then the children if they would want to hang nets, they wouldn't. They didn't have to if they didn't want to, but the parents would encourage them to do it, and the smaller ones would be hanging around there, and they would be playing around, running around on the shoreline. Maybe sometimes if it was afternoon, it would be swimming. And, it was just the atmosphere was just so positive, and the families got to visit and be around each other. While it was a strong family unit, like when my dad, the way he talks, he was there with his grandfather and his grandma, and then other cousins that my grandparents. He had 2 other males that he was raised with, and they were raised like brothers. And there was 4 of them, but they were raised like brothers, and they all worked together. Did they?
How long did these fish camps go on? Like, were they over a series of days, or daily, or seasonally?
They would go on all summer.
All summer, and people came and went, and
they would. Describing a fish camp, like my grandparents' house was kind of like maybe a quarter mile away up on a hill.
Mm-hmm.
But then that was a long walk. You'd have to go down a hill and maybe through some low land to get to the edge of the lake. And so that was a long walk. So they would just put the camp up there, and they would walk down there every morning and every afternoon, to get things done. And that's why they would put the fire and maybe have coffee, or maybe even have a little cooking area, like a little kettle or something. Not a big kitchen, just somewhere to cook maybe some fish soup or something. They would hang it over a fire going there, and they'd bring out, all the family and walk down there in the morning, and they would hang out there until maybe they were done by 10:30, 11 o'clock, 11 a.m. All the nets would be up and on the racks. All the fish would be iced up, and the men would be carrying the fish boxes up to the hill, for the truck to pick up. And that was they use those big fish boxes. They were half as big as that table right there, and they'd be full of fish. They'd probably weigh a good 120 pounds. So they'd have to carry those kind of like at least 1,000 feet up the hill, and then they set them there. They'd be all ice on the bottom. They'd put ice on the bottom of the box, and then they'd put ice on the top, to keep then they'd tack on a cover, and they would keep the fish, nice and cold for the truck to come pick up. But that was kind of like the last thing they would do. The nets would be all hung up by the family and relatives, cousins, male cousins, girl cousins, that were there working, and that was kind of an income for everybody. So they all wanted to get a little bit of income. It wasn't much, but they all wanted to be involved in that. So they would have a little bit, maybe $5. They'd maybe make $5 in a week, maybe $10 in a week, and they were happy with that. And that went on. They would start the season usually opened in this fish camp. They would have it on the shore there. It would stay there all summer until fall time, and families would walk down there every morning and work in there until they're done. Then after everything was done, with the nets were drying, and then that was it. They would go back up to the house and do their business there, whatever they had going on during the day. And but then in the afternoon, the males again, or females, whoever they decided to, you need to come help us drop these we call it setting nets. And they would come and they would go back down there, and like on hot summer days, though, you would have to go down there about 6 o'clock and start getting ready. 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and start move the boat into the water where it's floating, and then you'd have to carry the nets from the net rack to the boat. And that's where it came in, where whoever was in charge of, whoever was like the boat boss or the boss down there, they would have to determine, how the nets are laid in that boat, because there's a certain way they need to be laid in the boat. Yeah, and you gotta check the wind, because if you're out there dropping your nets and you put them in the boat wrong, the chances are when you're putting your nets in, your boat could blow over them, and then they start getting caught on the boat. My dad taught me that when you go out there, that wind is always gotta be blowing the boat away from the net, so that the boat don't blow over the top of the nets. That was one thing, you always had to check the wind. You had to look when you're start bringing the nets. Then you gotta look out on the lake, and you gotta look at the wind, and you gotta decide which way do we lay the nets in the boat. So that person had to know the wind, to be able to lay those nets in a boat. Because I remember going out there one time with some young guys my age that got me from my dad's house, and they said, "Can you come help us nets. My ma got us a pickup. She got us a boat and motor, and she got us some nets.
Mm-hmm.
Can you come help us set nets? I said, okay. And I did go with them guys, and I wasn't in charge. They were in charge. And these guys they didn't have the foggiest idea of where to start.
Mm-hmm.
I just went along and sat there and watched them and then helped them, and they must have. But this was back when they started using outboard motors.
Mm-hmm.
They must have ran over the nets 4 or 5 times. But that's why you needed to understand, how to drop the nets in the. But getting back to that, you needed to understand the wind conditions, weather conditions,
Mm-hmm.
being involved. They always made sure got to be safe. That safety is very important. My dad said his grandpa would tell him the same thing. Safety is very important. You can't risk that. Can't take anything for granted out there.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't really explain that to me, but that's where I used to listen to them talk, and my dad, and that's where I kind of he never really come out and said the lake has a spirit, but
Mm-hmm.
but everything he explained to me, you could just tell that's what he meant.
Mm-hmm.
You gotta respect that lake, and you gotta show honor to that lake, because if that lake can get mean if it wants to, it can tear you up. It can take you out if it wanted to, the lake.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that, but getting back to dropping the nets in the afternoon, evening time is they understood that on the hot summer days where it gets to be 80 degrees, 90 degrees. It's not good to go put your nets down early in the afternoon, because then when the nets would go down, they would start catching the fish right away. The fish would start getting caught, and you don't want to have your fish in a net caught under the water on her for like 12, 14 hours. They would go out, and they understood that, and they would go out late on a 80, 90 degree day. They would go out, like 6, 7 o'clock, because by the time they got out there, it was like 7, and it was getting late in the evening, and it was cooling down, and then the nets wouldn't be out there so long, because once they dropped them in, then they'd be done. They'd be done by 7:30
Mm-hmm.
in the evening, 8 o'clock, and there was even times where I've been on a lake at 9:30, and going in, and it was just, the sun was setting, it was getting dark, and there was even times that we've done that because it would be too hot out to go drop the nets down, and that would be like an afternoon of how they did it, that I recall, and sometimes I remember. Sometimes it'd be so hot out there that we'd be, as soon as we get done dropping the nets, we'd just fall right off the boat and take a swim, go swimming, way out in the middle of the lake, way out. That was after we started using outboard motors. My dad always had an outboard motor, as long as I remember, going way back in the 60s. I do remember, some of them oaring with oars out there. That was kind of a task there, but it was done. It could be done. So that was then in the morning time. They always told us you got to be out there right when that sun is coming up. As a matter of fact, you got to be prepping and getting ready to head out there when it's still dark out. Then by the time you get to where you're in, they had flags. They would construct these cool flags. Those men, they had this method of making a flag. You'd be looking and it'd be standing up waving at you. You could see it from the shoreline.
Mm-hmm.
And that was where your nets were at. They'd have certain colors, and they had one on each end. And so you could see those bright and really bright now. They'd make them like red or orange or a bright color that you could see from a mile away, maybe even 2.5 miles away, and they would know direct. But then there was some of the guys were such experienced that driving out in the morning after their gill nuts, they didn't even really need a flag. They just had like a GPS built into their brain, you know, and they would. That's where again you paid attention to the wind and the weather, and you paid attention to direction. You know, everybody knew where they were at and what direction they were going, and they would just go right directly to wherever their marker was at, and they would be out there at right when the sun was coming up. Can you imagine looking to the east and seeing the sun just coming up, just a little sliver of it? Then you get there and you start lifting your nets, and the sun just gradually comes up, and it's just beautiful out there on the lake, especially when it's no wind. But it's also beautiful when it's windy. When there's wind too, it's just beautiful out there and it's so peaceful and out there, you know, this lifting your nets. And again, if there's a wind out there, you know, when you're lifting your nets in the morning with the fish in them, you know, you have to know which side of the boat to pull them in, because again, you don't want to, you know, run over the boat floating over the top of your nets, because then they start getting caught on something under the boat or on the edge of the boat. You know, you're going to have to stop and figure out a way to get it out. And
How old were kids when they went out to start learning about fishing?
Well, my dad took me out when I was 8.
Okay.
But I did ride in a boat watching as a little 5-year-old, 6-year-old.
Yeah.
Then my son, Corey, I brought him out there when he was 6 years old, 5 years old. And he put on some rubber boots, and he came out there just with me alone to lift nets in the morning. And I was lifting the nets, putting them in boxes. And he stood there and he moved them boxes around for me. You know, he would take it and put it where I told him to put it. Because even when you lift those, you know, that's how old he was, you know. You know, and he started learning that, and he was happy. He was more than happy to, you know, to be out there with me and moving those boxes around and working by my side. You know, it was just a little task that he started out doing. And he was only 6 years old, 5 or 6 years old when I brought him out there. And he was happy. He wanted to do that. You know, he was just happy to be able to get in a boat and come out on a lake with me. You know, and he just wanted to be around me and wanted to help me out. That's, you know, at that age. So, and my father, he did the same thing to me. He brought me out there, and he had me doing little things like, you know, simple things. You know, when he was doing what he was in control. He was in charge. You know, and it was his responsibility to get this job done. It was not mine, you know, at that age, but he just brought me along, and any little task he needed done, he would ask me to do it. And that had to do with, you know, moving the anchors or moving the motor, you know, things like that, you know. And I brought my other son out there when he was like 2-3 years old, just to come right along. And my other children, I brought them out, you know, not the other kids, the sons. I brought them out, you know, at a very young age, just to come right along and you know, maybe you know, do some type of you know, assignment while they're working with me. And there's a lot of people here back then that you know, took their children out there to, you know, to let them observe and let them see what was going on, and maybe move something. You know, it wasn't, you know, their responsibility to get the job done. It was adults. You know, they just kind of kind of said, well, I want to go along, and then if you needed something moved or something done, they would do it, And there was many families up here back then, probably in the 50s, maybe more so in the 50s, that brought their young children out there just to give them little simple assignments to help out. And that's where that all started, and they would also have that's where the net hanging, hanging it on the racks. The children, were young. There's a picture in that Charles Brill book where there's these kids standing on fish boxes hanging nets, and I remember those kids that time. I know who they are. Actually, they're my age. And that's what they had us doing. We would have to stand on a box to hang those nets, and they kind of wanted us to do simple things like that, just hang them up, and you had to take out. There was knots in there from the fish tangling net. You'd have to take those out, and it just became a whole entire family thing, that. Working together like that with all your dad and your uncles and cousins. Sometimes the mother would come around, and she would help out, and it was just everybody working together.
Did women ever go out on the lake?
Yeah.
They did too. Okay. They were fisher. They went fishing as well?
Well, they usually, they would help drop the nets because that was kind of a lighter job, and they would go along, to move the boxes around,
Yeah.
like when they're lifting the nets, they would be out there and doing things like that, just helping out. But I don't recall that happening very often where they're pulling in the net with the fish. That was always a man's.
Heavy. That's heavy.
Yeah. And I don't ever recall.
Need body.
Yeah. So there was but they would go out, and help out, on the lake, and one thing my dad told me that after they got into using outboard motors, he told me you always had to have a knife. In that, there's a little container in the back where the water comes in and drains out, Always have a knife there. You always keep a knife there all the time.
Because you get fouled, or because?
No, just in case, I was talking about the wind.
Yeah.
In case the wind blows you the wrong way, twists you around, and your nets get caught in your prop.
Yeah.
He said, don't even fool around trying to get the net out, to reach down there and cut it off because on a windy day, if you don't maneuver the boat right, the prop will get caught in the nets, and I've seen that happen to me even, where the prop ended up in the nets, and as soon as the prop gets in the nets, if you don't get it out right away,
burn your motor.
Then what happens is the direction the wind is going, and the prop is hooked on the nets, the boat is going to flip around and point in the same direction as the wind. And the waves, sometimes you'll have 4 or 5 foot waves out there. They'll be coming from your back, and your prop is hooked in there. So then sometimes those waves are splashing, and they'll splash right into the back of your boat and start filling up your boat. I've had that happen, and you gotta know what to do. You got to know what to do. And I remember that happened one time, and my cousins my age were not experienced as I was, and they start panicking, and I had to give them direction from where I was at. You had to grab the section of the net and start, that even leaving the prop and take it and start running it around the edge of the boat, start pulling it in, and you got to take it and grab on at the top of the boat. You got to walk it all the way along and grab on the top and hold the net right there. It's still caught in a prop, and your boat will turn back around. Away, the tip will be in the wind, and the back will be over there. And that's where you got it. Then you just work on getting the net on the prop. Them are some of the things that, as a fisherman, you need to understand. And another thing was no alcohol or drugs. Yeah. It takes a lot. All of these things that I've learned. Growing up, watching and observing, and my father explaining to me. Back in the 60s, the 70s, all the things that he was explaining to me. You can't learn that in school. Mm-hmm. You can't learn that, the commercial fishes lake, you can't go to college and go learn that in college. When I was going to UMD, I'd be out there, I'd come home in the summertime, and me and my dad would work together, and he always I look forward to working with my dad. And they would ask me what I was going to college for. And I said, well, I don't know. I said, I'm just going to college. I said, I guess I'm just gonna end up being the most educated commercial fisherman here in Red Lake. That's fine with me. I said, I'll be using $100 words while I'm lifting up the nets. But that's what the guys would ask me when we'd be pulling nets. They'd be saying, well, what are you going to college for, Dad? The more type of things that we talk about, a lot of things is being on water, teasing each other and joking around, and sometimes somebody would flip and fall in a lake, at the shoreline, and we were always hoping that would happen to somebody so we could get a good laugh out of it, and just waiting for somebody to trip and fall in the water, and that was at the shoreline, not all the way out. But it was fun, we had good feelings. We had, we were earning, we were working, we were feeling good about the work ethic. Mm-hmm. It was work ethic. I didn't really realize it at the time, but I was learning a skill that nowadays is very rare for people to understand and to have that skill of what we were taught back in the 60s. Mm-hmm. What is this? It's just, it's not here today, Mm.
So this lasted, I guess, up until about the 1990s, thereabouts?
1990, I believe, if my memory serves me right, I decided, in 1994, I think it was, that I don't want to go at this anymore, and I stopped early that spring, and I didn't do it all summer.
Things were changing on the lake, though, too.
Yeah.
And that brought about discussion.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Be sure to join us next week as we hear part 2 from RLNC instructor and academic advisor Dr. Carla Norris Rainbird in her interview with RLNC board member and RLNC spiritual advisor William May, conducted in July 2019. Miigwech!
Miigwech to the following for their efforts in the creation of this Red Lake Nation College Gikendaasowin Podcast episode. Opening and closing music by Director of Equity, Cultural Education, and Archives, Floyd Buck Jourdain. Opening introduction and closing preview by Recruitment and Retention Coordinator and Director of Social Media, Micah Whitecloud. Our host this week, RLNC instructor and academic advisor, Dr. Carla Norris Rainbird. Our guest speaker this week, RLNC board member and spiritual advisor, William May. Production by Innovation Center Coordinator Brandon Spears. And the National Endowment for the Humanities for their generous support. Miigwech, and have a good day.